The bottle didn't shatter on the floor. It shattered against the side of Hannah Whitlock's head, and in the half-second before the diner's fluorescent lights smeared into white, the only thought that surfaced in her mind was that she still had 4 tables left to close. 27 years old, 2 jobs, $11 in her checking account, and now 11 stitches arcing under her hairline. That was the arithmetic of her life, and it had never once added up in her favor. So she did what she'd always done when the ground gave out beneath her. She reached for her brother. She pressed his name with a hand that wouldn't stop shaking, and she waited for Caleb's voice, the one steady thing she'd had since their mother died. The phone rang once, twice. "Caleb," she whispered the moment it connected, the words spilling out before she could stop them. "He took the bottle, and he hit me in the head with it. I heard it break." But the voice that answered wasn't her brother's. It was low, unhurried, carved out of something colder than concrete, the kind of voice this city had learned not to look at directly. Hannah didn't know that name yet. She didn't know the man breathing quietly on the other end of her brother's phone was Roland Maddox, 37 years old, the man who moved half the freight through Chicago's underworld and had never once paused between a question and his answer. All she knew was that a stranger was holding the only number that had ever meant safety to her, that he wasn't explaining why, and that something in his silence told her the floor hadn't finished falling. And for the first time in longer than he could remember, Roland Maddox didn't have an answer he was willing to say out loud. If a story about a broken woman and the most dangerous man in Chicago is something you need to hear all the way to the end, do me a favor and tap that like button right now. Share this with someone who believes people can change. And subscribe to the channel so you don't miss a single part of what happens next. Now, let's go back to the night it all began. The phone in Roland Maddox's hand wasn't his. It was a cheap model, its screen split by a single crack, its casing scratched and worn, the kind of phone a man bought only when every dollar in his pocket already had somewhere else it needed to go. It had been sitting in Roland's coat pocket for 3 days, because he still hadn't decided what to do with the things a dead man left behind. He was standing by the window of his office on the 40th floor, watching the river move black and slow beneath the bridges, when it began to vibrate against his chest. The name glowing on the screen in the darkness looked up at him like a silent accusation. Hannah. He stared at it for a long while, then answered, because picking up a ringing phone was a reflex older than thought, and because some part of him wanted to know who would call a man who could no longer answer. Now there was a woman crying in his ear, telling him about a bottle and a sound she couldn't erase from her mind. And Roland Maddox, a man who had buried business partners without losing his appetite, found himself unsure what to do with the trembling shape inside her voice. He didn't tell her who he was. He didn't tell her anything at all. He let the silence stretch in the exact way he had always let silence do most of his work for him. And he listened as her breathing changed on the other end of the line. Quick, shallow, and broken. The breathing of someone trying to hold herself together with both hands. "Caleb?" she called again, smaller this time. "Say something. Please." "He can't come to the phone right now." The sentence came out flat, truthful, and useless all at once, and Roland heard her stop breathing. "Where are you? Who are you?" Her voice cracked right down the middle. "Why do you have my brother's phone? Where is he? Where is Caleb? Which hospital?" No, you have to tell me." A sound caught in her throat, half sob, half fury. "I called my brother. I want my brother." "Who are you?" Roland closed his eyes. Outside, 40 floors below, the city kept doing its indifferent work. Tens of thousands of lit windows belonging to people whose worst night was still smaller than hers tonight. He could hang up. That would be the clean move, the wise move, the move that kept a stranger's pain from becoming his business. He had built an entire life on knowing exactly where the door was and stepping through it before anyone could open their mouth and ask him to stay. He didn't hang up. "Listen to me," he said, and there was something in that register that made her go still, the way people always went still around him without understanding why. "You're hurt. I can hear that. Right now, that's the only thing that matters. Tell me which hospital. I'll come there, and then we'll talk about your brother. Not before. I don't know you." The sentence came out as barely more than a breath. "I don't know you." "No," he agreed. "You don't know me." A silence fell. He could hear an announcement over the speakers behind her, a name being called, the particular kind of hush that belonged to a waiting room in the middle of the night. When she spoke again, her voice had thinned into the obedient softness of people too tired to keep fighting, and that, more than the crying, told him just how bad things were. "Mercy, General. she said. "West side of the city. Emergency entrance. Don't leave. Don't sign anything. Don't go anywhere with anyone." He was already moving, already reaching for the coat hanging over the back of his chair. "I'm coming to you." He ended the call before she could ask his name again. For a moment, he stood in the dark room with the dead man's phone still warm in his palm. Caleb Whitlock had worked for him for 2 years, had driven him through 3 cities and 1 ambush, and Roland had never once asked whether there was anyone at home waiting for that man to come back. It had never occurred to him, and that was the kind of thing he was beginning to learn about himself tonight, and he found he didn't much care for the lesson. Frank Delgado was waiting in the outer room, broad-shouldered and motionless, his eyes fixed on his own phone screen. He looked up the moment the door opened, reading his boss's face in half a second the way only a man who had survived for decades beside Roland could, then rose without needing an order. "Mercy, General," Roland said, pulling his coat over his shoulders. "West side. Now." Frank didn't ask who. He didn't ask why. He had learned a very long time ago that Roland would tell him exactly as much as Roland wanted to tell him, not 1 syllable more. But as the 2 of them moved toward the elevator, he allowed himself one quiet, careful remark. "That's the kid's phone." "I know what it is," Roland replied. The elevator doors closed on both their reflections, and neither of them said another word all the way down. Hannah sat in the farthest corner of the emergency waiting room, her back pressed against the cold wall, and she was counting the floor tiles. It was a habit she had carried since childhood, from those nights when her mother grew ill and their cramped house filled with a kind of silence no child should ever have to bear. Count something, anything, until both hands stopped trembling. Right now, she had reached the 47th tile when she realized she still hadn't counted enough to stop. The nurse had told her to sit still, not to move her head too much, and she had obeyed because obedience was what she was best at, because her whole life had been one long chain of listening to other people, so she could be left in peace. That stranger's words still pressed heavily inside her chest. "He can't come to the phone right now." The sentence kept repeating in her mind like a pebble rolling endlessly, refusing to settle, because she knew her brother. She knew Caleb would cross an entire burning city to answer if she called, and the thought that something had stopped him chilled her spine more than the wound on her head. She was counting the 60-second tile when the whole room changed. She didn't hear him arrive. She felt it. The way the air in the waiting room seemed to draw inward, the way the security guard by the door straightened a little, then decided to look somewhere else, the way a nurse hurrying past suddenly slowed, then stepped aside without understanding why she had done it. The man who entered wasn't in a hurry. He wore an expensive dark coat in that quiet way people only recognized once they had served men who dressed like that. The cut precise, not one unnecessary wrinkle, and he moved through the room thick with antiseptic and fear, as though the place belonged to him and everyone else was merely borrowing space. Hannah looked up, and she knew at once that he was the voice from the phone before he even opened his mouth, because the stillness coming off him was exactly like the silence that had pressed down on her through the line, a stillness that wasn't peaceful at all, but more like the surface of water before a storm. He stopped a few steps from her and looked down at her, curled in her diner uniform that still carried the smell of coffee and grease, and in that moment the distance between them appeared with cruel clarity. Her, with $11 in her account and shoes worn thin at the soles. Him, with an entire city that knew to lower its head when he passed. "You're Hannah," he said. Not as a question. She nodded, then regretted it when the pain stabbed behind her eyes. "Where is my brother?" she said. And though she was so exhausted she could barely sit upright, there was still a wire of steel pulled tight beneath her voice. "You have his phone. You know him. Where is he?" Roland didn't answer right away. He pulled a plastic chair closer, sat down across from her, and the movement narrowed the power between them with such calculated precision that she immediately grew wary, because she had lived long enough to know that when a man with power chose to lower himself to someone's eye level, it was usually because he wanted to take something. "I knew Caleb," he said, choosing each word as though choosing each step across thin ice. "He worked for me. 2 years. Doing what?" A hesitation passed, so slight it almost wasn't there. But Hannah made money listening to people for tips, and she recognized hesitation. "Driving," he said, along with a few other things. "Other things," she repeated, and this time she was the one who let the silence hang between them. "What kind of man are you that this whole room is afraid to look at you, Mr. Maddox?" He didn't seem surprised that she had guessed his last name. He only tilted his head slightly, as if acknowledging a well-played move. You're smarter than you look, he said. Don't talk to me like that. Her eyes suddenly filled with water, not from fear but from something worse, a premonition rising from the bottom of her stomach. You came all the way here in the middle of the night, a man like you, because of the phone of a waitress's brother. You don't do that just to tell me he drove for you. She swallowed hard. What are you hiding from me? Roland looked at her for a long time, and for the first time since he had entered, something shifted in that stone-carved face. A crack so small she almost wasn't sure she had truly seen it. You need to get stitched first, he said, standing and buttoning his coat again, raising the wall between them back into place. Then I'll tell you everything you need to know. I'm not lying to you, Hannah, but some things shouldn't be said in a place full of strangers. And Hannah, though every instinct in her was screaming for answers right then and there, found herself nodding, because she was too tired, because the floor was still there to count, and because somewhere deep inside her, she had begun to fear the very answer she was demanding. They took her into a small room behind the emergency department to finish stitching her up, and Roland waited outside in the hallway, leaning against a faded blue wall with both hands tucked into the pockets of his coat, so still that a passing nurse had to glance at him twice to make sure he was real. When Hannah came out, her head neatly bandaged, her face bloodless beneath the lights, he pushed himself away from the wall and nodded toward a door at the end of the hall, a small waiting room for relatives that stood empty, and she followed him inside, because she didn't have the strength left to do anything except follow. He closed the door behind them. The room held only 2 chairs and a low table, with a box of tissues already more than half gone, the kind of object people placed only in spaces long accustomed to tears. Hannah didn't sit down. She stood there with her back straight, her hands clenched tightly together in front of her stomach, and she looked at him with the eyes of someone who had already guessed but was still begging to be wrong. Say it, she said. Roland had killed men. He had given orders that made people vanish from the earth, had sat across from lifelong enemies without blinking, had learned how to say difficult things in a voice so flat that the calm itself became a weapon. And yet now, in front of this small, disheveled woman with $11 in her account, he felt his throat tighten in a way utterly unfamiliar to him. Caleb is gone, he said. 3 days ago. For one long moment, Hannah didn't move. Not a single muscle in her face changed, as though the words had been spoken in a language she had never learned. And Roland had witnessed enough reactions to death to know that this kind of stillness was more frightening than a scream. Then she shook her head, a small shake, almost polite. No, she said. No, you're wrong. I just texted him. Tuesday. He said he'd come by. He said he'd bring me some money because I was short on rent, he said. Her voice began to rise, not louder but faster, the words crowding over one another as though, if she said enough of them, the truth would have to step back. He can't be gone. He's the only one I have left. The only one. You don't understand. He's all that's left of my family. You can't stand there and tell me that. And then it hit her, not slowly, but all at once, like a dam breaking. She folded forward, one hand clamped over her mouth, and the sound that escaped her wasn't like ordinary crying. It was like something being torn from the very bottom of her chest. Low, naked, uncontrollable. Her knees gave way, and she didn't try to keep herself standing. She only slid down beside the chair she had refused to sit in and sank onto the floor, her shoulders shaking in waves. This was the woman who hadn't cried when a bottle shattered over her head, who had answered the nurse's questions in an even voice, who had counted floor tiles to keep her hands from trembling, and now she was breaking apart on the hospital floor because the only name that had ever meant safety to her was gone. Roland stood still. A part of him, the part that had been forged across 37 years to leave any room where tears appeared, pushed him to turn away. But he didn't turn away. He stood there and let her cry, because he understood, in a way he had no words to name, that he owed her at least this presence. Because 3 days earlier, under the sick yellow lights of a warehouse by the harbor, everything had collapsed in a matter of seconds, and when the moment that should have ended Roland Maddox came for him, he wasn't the one who took it. Caleb had been there. Caleb had thrown himself into the empty space between Roland and death without a single instant of hesitation, as if he had known, as if he had already decided it beforehand, and Roland had held a fading man in his arms without being able to understand why a hired man would choose to trade his life for someone like him. That question hadn't left him for 3 days. It was a debt with no number, no deadline, no possible way to repay it, and now it was sitting on the floor in front of him, sobbing, wearing the face of a woman who had just lost everything. He bent down, not touching her, only lowering himself to her level for the second time that night. And when he spoke, his voice was still flat, still cold, but slower, as though every word had to pass through some painful place before it could get out. "I'm here," he said. "You don't have to stand up right now. But when you're ready, there are things you need to know about your brother, and I'm the only one left to tell you." It took Hannah a long while to get up from the floor, and when she was finally sitting in the chair, both hands wrapped around a cup of water the nurse had brought in but she hadn't drunk, Roland pulled the remaining chair closer, sat down, and asked her in a calm voice what had happened to her head. Not because he hadn't already guessed, but because he wanted to hear her say it herself, and Hannah, exhausted to the point that she had no walls left to hold anything back, told him. She had worked at Halverson's Diner on Archer Avenue for 3 years, the night shift, from 6 in the evening until 2 in the morning, the shift nobody wanted, because late-night customers were usually drunk, and the tips were uncertain, but she took it because the night shift paid a little extra, and because during the day she still cleaned for an office cleaning company. Travis Boyd was the night manager, a man in his 40s with a beer belly and a habit of standing too close to the waitresses, and everyone at the diner knew to stay away from him, knew that the schedule was in his hands, knew that one complaint made in the wrong place could turn into 3 Monday night shifts in a row, or worse, into your name being crossed off the schedule completely. That night, the diner had closed to regular customers, but Travis told her to stay, said some important guests of his were coming by, some business friends, and he wanted her to stay and serve them, pour drinks, sit with them, laugh at their jokes, and when Hannah understood what that word serve meant by the way he said it, she refused. She said her shift was over. She needed to go home, and she tried to say it gently because she needed that job, needed every dollar from it. But Travis had been drinking since early on, and liquor brought the worst part of him to the surface. When she still wouldn't back down, when she reached for her purse and said she was leaving, everything happened very fast right there at the bar, where the bottles of liquor stood in neat rows beneath the yellow light. She didn't tell that moment again. She didn't need to. The white bandage wrapped around her head had already spoken for her, but she told him what came after. The part where she staggered out of the diner with one side of her face wet and hot, while the 2 other employees on the night shift stood frozen behind the counter, and no one dared to move, and one of them, a boy of only 20 who was carrying student loans, couldn't bring himself to look her in the eye. "Travis has connections," Hannah said, her voice dry now after all the crying. "He knows people nobody wants to get tangled up with, and everyone who works there knows that." So when she said she was going to call the police, that same boy was the one who whispered to her not to, that doing it would only cost her more, that no one would testify because no one could afford to trade away their job, and that was why she hadn't called the police. That was why she had sat alone in the emergency room, counting floor tiles and pressing the only name she trusted. Roland listened to all of it, not interrupting once, his face revealing nothing beyond absolute attention. But beneath that mask, something had been set into its proper place, with the familiar cold precision of a gun being loaded in the dark. When she finished, he stood, stepped out into the hallway, and Frank Delgado peeled himself away from the wall where he had been waiting the entire time. "Travis Boyd," Roland said, his voice so low it was just enough for the 2 of them to hear. "Night manager at Halverson's on Archer. Find out about him. Everything. Who he knows, who he owes, who he fears, who he does business with." Frank gave one nod, and didn't ask what it was for, because he had worked for Roland long enough to understand what that voice meant. The voice his boss used only when a name had just been moved from the column of strangers into another column, the kind of column no one wanted their name placed in. Roland stood there in the hospital hallway for a moment, looking through the narrow crack of the door into the small room where Hannah sat holding the cup of water she hadn't drunk, and the instinct that had guided his whole life, the instinct to handle every problem with power and fear, was running smoothly through his blood as it always had. He didn't know yet that this very instinct, in only a few days, would collide with something it had never encountered before. When Hannah was finally discharged at nearly 4 o'clock in the morning, she was taken to the billing counter with that familiar stack of papers every poor person in America feared. The emergency room bill with numbers so long they almost stopped meaning anything, and she was standing there calculating which meals she would have to skip, which rent payment she would have to delay, how many extra shifts she would have to work to pay it off, when the woman behind the counter looked up in confusion and said the entire cost had already been paid in full, In cash, by a man who had left no name. Hannah didn't need to ask to know who it was. She found Roland waiting near the exit, and anger rose inside her so suddenly it left her dizzy. An anger that had probably been smoldering all night beneath the pain and grief, and had now found somewhere to escape. "You had no right," she said, her voice trembling but clear. "You didn't ask me. You don't know me. You can't just pay for me and think that settles everything." Roland looked at her with the calm expression of a man who had never had anyone question his kindness, because to him it wasn't kindness at all, but a calculation, an expense meant to close a line of debt in his ledger. "I owe your brother," he said. "This is how I repay it." "No," she answered at once. "That's how you make yourself feel better. You think a stack of cash can erase the fact that he died?" The sentence hung between them in the empty hospital lobby, and for the first time that night, Roland didn't have an answer ready. He told her he had arranged an apartment in another neighborhood, safer, that the place where she was living wasn't safe anymore once Travis Boyd knew she was still in the city, that he would have someone take her there that very morning. And Hannah heard in his voice the tone of a man used to giving orders and being obeyed, and it was exactly that tone that made her take one step back. "You're deciding for me," she said. "That's exactly what Travis does. Stay, go, sit down, pour the drinks. You think you're different from him because you have more money, but both of you are telling me I don't get to choose my own life." Roland fell silent, and she saw that the words had struck somewhere he hadn't expected, because his face briefly hardened in the way a person's face does when someone touches a wound they didn't even know they had. Just then, the sliding glass doors opened and a woman about Hannah's age rushed in, her hair hastily pinned up, her coat worn inside out, her face frightened, and when she saw Hannah, she let out a sob and crossed the lobby to pull her friend into her arms, careful to avoid the bandaged part of her head. It was Dana Mercer, the woman who worked the same shift at Halverson's, the one who hadn't been there the night it happened, because she had traded shifts with someone else, and had been calling Hannah non-stop since she heard the news. "Oh my God, your face," Dana said, cupping Hannah's face in both hands, her eyes red. "I'm going to kill Travis. I swear, I will." Then she stopped, noticing the man in the dark coat standing a few steps away with the posture of someone who owned every room he entered, and Dana shot Hannah a wary, questioning glance. Hannah explained briefly that he knew Caleb and said nothing more, and Dana, sharp in the way of someone who had waited tables long enough to read strangers in 3 seconds, didn't ask anything else, but she didn't take her eyes off him either. When Dana pulled Hannah into a corner and whispered to ask whether she was all right, whether she needed a place to stay because Dana's apartment was cramped, but there was still a sofa, Hannah felt something warm rise in her chest, something all of Roland's cash couldn't buy, the presence of someone who had nothing to give except herself. "I'll stay with Dana," Hannah said, turning back toward Roland, her voice steadier now. "Not at your apartment. If you really owe my brother, then the way to repay him isn't to turn me into something you put away somewhere safe." Roland looked at the two women leaning against each other, one holding the other up with the only thing they had, and he realized, with a strange and uncomfortable feeling, that this was the first time in many years someone had refused what he offered without being afraid. 2 days later, Roland came to Dana's cramped apartment in Bridgeport, where Hannah was sleeping on the sofa and living on cold coffee and broken stretches of sleep, and he didn't call ahead. He simply appeared at the door with a small box in his hand, one he had personally retrieved from the precinct before the police could bury the file, the kind of box used to return a dead man's belongings, and Hannah knew what was inside before he could say a word. Dana was working the afternoon shift, so there were only the two of them in the small room flooded with late daylight, and Hannah sat down on the edge of the sofa, with the box resting on her lap, but didn't open it, because she wasn't ready to see her brother's cheap watch, his key ring, his thin wallet. "He told me he worked security," Hannah said, her eyes fixed on the box. "For a security company. Night shifts at warehouses. I believed him. For 2 years, I believed him." Roland stood leaning against the doorframe. He didn't sit down, and he let the silence stretch before saying that it hadn't been entirely a lie, that Caleb had indeed guarded warehouses. Only those warehouses belonged to him, and the things inside them weren't always legal. "Why?" Hannah looked up. "Why would he work for someone like you? He was the kindest man I ever knew." Roland looked at her for a while, as though weighing how much truth she could bear in one day. Then he said evenly that Caleb had come to him 3 years earlier, with a debt he couldn't possibly pay. A medical debt. Hannah went still. She knew about the illness. Of course she knew. She had once dropped out of nursing school halfway through to care for him during the worst months, had once sat beside a hospital bed counting the rhythm of a breathing machine, but she had thought it was over, had thought insurance had covered most of it, had thought her brother had recovered, and everything had returned to normal. "He hid it from me," she whispered. "He hid from me that the bills were still there. More than $80,000, Roland said, with interest piling up. The collection companies had started calling. "He didn't want you to know because you had already left school for him once, and he would rather work for a man like me than let you sacrifice anything more." The words landed between them like a stone, and Hannah felt two things rise inside her at once. A fierce anger that her brother had carried all of it alone, without giving her the chance to share it, and a pain so deep it twisted through her gut when she understood that every dollar he had pressed into her hand over the last 3 years, every time he had helped her with rent, every time he had told her not to worry, that he had it covered, all of it had been bought by him, standing guard in the dark over things that could kill him, and in the end had killed him after all. "You let him do that," she said, and this time her voice didn't tremble. It was sharp as broken glass. "You knew how desperate a person had to be to come to you, and you used that. You didn't lend him money the way a decent man would have. You made him pay in blood." Roland didn't deny it. That was what made her falter, because he didn't defend himself, didn't say Caleb had chosen it, didn't say it had been a fair arrangement. He only looked at her and said yes. That was how his world worked. That he saw a man who needed something he had, and he named a price, and the price was always the person himself. "Did you know his name?" Hannah asked, and the question made him stop short. "I mean really know it. In the 2 years he worked for you, did you ever know what he liked to eat? What he was afraid of? That he had a younger sister waiting tables who dreamed of finishing nursing school? Or was he just a name in a column to you? A debt being collected?" Roland opened his mouth, then closed it again, and his silence was a more brutal answer than anything he could have said. "You're the richest, most powerful man I've ever met," Hannah said softly, hugging the box of belongings to her chest. "And you're the poorest, because you had him beside you for 2 years, and you never truly saw him once." Roland didn't answer. He stood there in the small room as it slowly darkened, and for the first time since he could remember, someone had just given the thing he had always been its true name, and he had no way to deny it. 4 days later, Hannah heard from a former coworker that Travis Boyd had been abruptly let go from Halverson's, without any official explanation, and that someone had seen him leave the diner with a bloodless face after 2 strange men had spent an entire evening waiting for him in the parking lot. By afternoon, Roland appeared in Bridgeport with the bearing of a man bringing good news and expecting it to be received that way. "He's lost his job," he said, standing in the middle of the small room. "He understands that if he comes near you one more time, he'll lose more than a job." He said it calmly, almost with relief, as though setting a gift on the table and stepping back to wait for her reaction. And for a moment he truly believed she would be grateful, that this was what anyone in her position would want, the man who had hurt her punished quickly, cleanly, and decisively by a power he wouldn't dare fight. But Hannah didn't thank him. She rose from the edge of the sofa, and he saw that familiar thing return to her eyes, that wire of steel pulled tight beneath the exhaustion. "You did it again," she said. "Decided for me again." Roland stopped, genuinely confused in a rare way, because he couldn't understand how what he had just done could be seen as a mistake. "He split your head open," he said, his voice showing for the first time something close to irritation. "I made him pay without you having to lift a finger. Did you want him still walking around out there untouched?" "I wanted," Hannah said, stepping closer, not retreating at all beneath the weight of him. "I wanted him to go to court. I wanted to stand before a judge and say what he did, under my real name, in a room where the record would remain forever. I wanted him to have a criminal conviction follow him for the rest of his life, so the next woman he tries to hurt can search his name online and know to stay away. That's justice. What you just did, 2 men in a parking lot, a threat in the dark, that isn't justice. That's only a bigger monster, frightening a smaller monster. And tomorrow morning he'll still be a free man walking through this city, just a little more afraid." Roland opened his mouth to say that her way wouldn't get anywhere, that the courts for poor people were a slow and merciless machine, that men like Travis had always slipped free, but Hannah had already seen that coming. "I know," she said, her voice softer but not weaker. "I know I might lose. I know maybe no one will testify. Maybe he'll hire a better lawyer. Maybe I'll stand there and tell the whole story, and still walk away with nothing. But that's my risk to choose. Do you understand? My whole life, people have decided for me. My boss, my landlord, the hospital bill, and now you. My brother died so I wouldn't have to sacrifice anymore. And now you're standing there taking away the one thing I can still do for myself. She stopped, her chest rising and falling, her eyes bright not with tears but with something harder. If I let you handle him your way, then this story becomes yours, not mine. And I'm so tired of my life belonging in someone else's hands. Roland stood still for a very long time. He had spent his whole life in a world where power was the only language, where a problem was solved by making it disappear, and no one, not an enemy, not a cop, not a judge, had ever made him question that logic itself. Yet this woman, with nothing in her hands except an uncertain job and a head that had just been closed with 11 stitches, had left him standing there without words. "Then what do you want me to do?" he said at last, and it was a real question, perhaps the first honest question he had asked anyone in years. "Nothing at all," Hannah replied. "That's the hardest part. I know. Don't handle it. Let me do it myself. If you truly want to repay my brother, then believe I'm strong enough to stand on my own 2 feet, exactly the way he always believed." Across the city, inside a private club with dark paneled wood walls and yellow light deliberately kept dim enough to leave everything in shadow, Vernon Stagg sat at his usual table with an untouched glass of malt whiskey and listened. Vernon was in his 50s, his silver hair neatly cut, his suit custom-tailored, looking more like an investment banker than a man who controlled half the routes Roland Maddox didn't control, and that was exactly how he wanted people to see him, because Vernon believed showy violence was the mark of a man without imagination. He had spent years waiting for a crack in Roland, a soft place, something that could be squeezed, because the port of Chicago was large enough to make 2 men rich, but not large enough for both of them to be kings. And Vernon had decided long ago that only one man would survive this struggle. Sitting across from him was a man in his 40s, broad-shouldered, with a face so ordinary it was easy to forget, the kind of face that was useful in his line of work, and Otis Lund spoke softly, steadily, with the bored air of a man reporting the weather. Otis had worked for Roland for many years, long enough to be trusted, close enough to know things only an insider would know, and he told Vernon about a woman. "Maddox never takes his eyes off business," Otis said, lightly turning the glass in his hand. "Never has. In all the years I've been around him, there's never been anything but business. But this week he's gone twice to an apartment in Bridgeport, driving himself, alone, not for work." Vernon lifted one eyebrow, and Otis went on, telling him about the waitress, about the fact that she was the sister of the young driver who had died that night at the warehouse, about Roland paying her hospital bills, trying to move her somewhere safe, doing things Otis had never seen him do for anyone in his entire career. Vernon listened with the focus of a crocodile lying still beneath the surface of the water, and when Otis finished, he let the silence stretch, took his first sip of whiskey that evening, then said, almost to himself, that it was interesting. "A man with nothing to lose is a man who can't be controlled," Vernon said. "That's what has made Maddox dangerous all this time. He has no wife, no children, no living parents, not one thing in this world we can put a hand on to make him sit down at the negotiating table." He stopped, his eyes brightening in the dim yellow light. "But now, perhaps, he has just created something for himself." Otis said nothing, only gave one very slight nod, and if in that moment a flicker of hesitation crossed his empty face, no one saw it, because the room was too dark, and Vernon was too absorbed in the vision forming inside his own mind. "Find out about her," Vernon said. "Name, address, habits, every route she takes. Don't touch her. Not yet. A card only has value when the opponent doesn't know we're holding it." He turned the glass, watching the amber liquid catch the light. "For years, I've tried to find a way to force Roland Maddox to give me the port, and God has just dropped a waitress into my hands. Life can be very generous sometimes." Otis left the club a few minutes later, stepping out onto the rain-wet street where the streetlights spilled down into the puddles in blurred yellow halos, and he stood there longer than necessary, lighting a cigarette with a hand that didn't tremble, watching traffic drift past, wearing the hollow expression of a man who had gone too far down a road to turn back. Whether or not some buried part of him knew that the name he had just sold to Vernon Stagg would bring consequences even he couldn't yet fully imagine, and that the woman in Bridgeport, the woman who had only just demanded back the right to decide her own life, had now become a piece on a board she didn't even know existed. On the advice of a hospital social worker, Hannah began seeing Dr. Ruth Abernathy once a week, a psychologist who worked for a nonprofit program supporting victims of violence, a woman in her 50s, with gray hair tied neatly back, and a small office whose window looked out over an old oak tree. During the first few sessions, Hannah mostly just sat there, counting the patterns in the rug, because she wasn't used to anyone asking how she felt and truly wanting to hear the answer. Dr. Abernathy didn't rush. She never lectured, never offered ready-made comfort, only asked short questions and let silence do its work. One afternoon, when Hannah told her about Roland paying the hospital bill, arranging the apartment, and handling Travis without asking her, the doctor asked a question that stayed with Hannah for many days afterward. "There's a difference," Dr. Abernathy said, "between being saved by someone and standing back up on your own. When someone saves you, you owe them, and what happened to you still belongs to them, decided by them. But when you stand up by yourself, even if it's slower, even if it hurts more, what you take back can't be taken away from you again. The question isn't which way is faster. The question is who you want this story to belong to later." Hannah carried those words with her all week, and they came back to her one evening when Roland stopped by, this time carrying nothing with him. No box, no offer, just coming in and sitting down in the chair across from the sofa, as though it had become a habit neither of them was willing to name. He asked her about Caleb, not about the debt or the work, but about who he had been, and Hannah realized this was the first time he had ever asked that way. She stayed quiet for a while, then told him about one winter when she was 9 and Caleb was 14, the first year after their mother died, when their father had left and the two of them were living with an aunt who was almost never home. That Christmas Eve, there were no presents, no tree, nothing at all. Only a cold apartment and 2 children. "And Caleb," Hannah said, her voice softening in the way it only did when someone touched a memory that had been carefully preserved. Caleb took the old radio from the kitchen, the kind that could only pick up a few stations, and he turned the dial back and forth until he found one playing Christmas music. Then he pulled me into the middle of the living room and started dancing. A 14-year-old boy clumsily waltzing with his 9-year-old sister on an ice-cold floor. And he kept making silly faces until I laughed, because he couldn't stand seeing me sad on Christmas Eve. She stopped, her eyes shimmering, but her lips smiling. He was 14, and he already knew that sometimes the most important thing one person can do for another is simply not let them be sad alone. Roland said nothing. He sat there in the small room and listened, and something was happening inside him that he didn't have the words to describe, because in the 2 years Caleb Whitlock had worked for him, that man had been nothing more to him than a number. A debt being collected, a name in a ledger, and now, suddenly, he was seeing a 14-year-old boy waltzing in a cold apartment so his little sister would stop crying, and the image cut into him in a place he had thought had gone numb long ago. He had looked at hundreds of people as if they were tools, had priced them by what they could do for him, and discarded them when they no longer had value. And for the first time, he wondered how many of them had once been a boy waltzing for someone, how many people he had turned into a number without ever bothering to ask their real name. He said nothing at all, because he wasn't the kind of man who would admit such a thing aloud, and the change in him wasn't a door thrown open, only a very small crack in a very thick wall. But when he left the apartment that night, he sat in his car for a long time before starting the engine, staring into empty space, hearing again and again in his mind the words that sometimes the most important thing a person could do was simply not let someone else be sad alone. And he couldn't remember the last time anyone had done that for him. Roland's visits gradually became more frequent, and they both pretended not to notice. He made one excuse after another, checking whether she needed anything, bringing a few papers related to Caleb that had to be handled, but the truth was that he came because the small apartment in Bridgeport was the only place in his entire world where no one was afraid of him, where a woman looked him straight in the eye and said exactly what she thought. One evening, after Dana had gone to sleep in her room and only the 2 of them remained at the scratched kitchen table with 2 cups of coffee, Hannah asked him why he always paid, why every solution of his began and ended with money. And Roland said, a little defensively, that money solved everything, that it was the only language everyone understood. "It doesn't," Hannah said, setting her coffee cup down. "You pay people because that way you never have to really look at them. You gave Caleb money instead of asking what he was afraid of. You paid my hospital bill instead of staying and asking what I needed. You threw 2 men into Travis's parking lot instead of asking what kind of justice I wanted." She looked at him, her eyes not accusing at all, but almost compassionate. And that was what made the words hurt more. You save people with money because you don't know how to respect them. Respecting someone means believing they have the right to choose for themselves, that they aren't a problem for you to solve. But you never learned how to do that, did you? Because in your world, a person and a debt are the same thing. Roland didn't answer right away, and inside that silence was a new kind of tension. Not exactly anger, but the feeling of a man who had just been seen all the way to the bottom by the only person he didn't want seeing that far, and he sat there for a long time with both hands wrapped around his cold coffee cup, a man unaccustomed to having nothing to say. He left that night without arguing, and Hannah thought perhaps she had pushed him too far. But in the days that followed, things began to change in ways she couldn't see. There was a man named Eddie Kessler, who owed Roland's organization a debt that had been overdue for months. A mechanic with a small shop barely staying alive and a sick wife. And by the usual rules, at this point they would take the shop, turn it into a lesson for other debtors. But Roland made a call and erased the debt, saying only that it was finished, then hanging up before the man could stammer out a question about why. A few days later, an associate brought him a lucrative contract involving the transport of a kind of product Roland knew would eventually end up in the hands of people selling it to kids at high schools on the south side of the city, a deal the old version of him would have signed without blinking because the profit was too great to refuse. But this time, he pushed the folder back across the table and said no, leaving the associate staring at him in shock as though he had spoken in a foreign language. Roland didn't tell Hannah about any of this, and that was what mattered. He didn't do it so she would praise him. He did it because, for the first time in his life, there was a voice in his head, the voice of a woman sitting at a kitchen table asking him why a human being and a debt had become the same thing, and he found he could no longer answer that question the way he once had, but he was still himself. And one evening when he saw Hannah again, when the space between them on the small chair had become close enough that both of them were fully aware of it, when she lifted her eyes and their gaze held longer than an ordinary look should, it was Roland who stood and stepped back, because he knew exactly what kind of man he was, knew exactly what his hands had done, and he wouldn't allow himself to pull this woman into that darkness just because, for the first time in many years, he wanted something for himself. "You should sleep," he said, his voice rougher than usual, and he left more quickly than he needed to, carrying in his chest something that felt both like hope and like a wound, two things he had never learned how to tell apart. Frank Delgado found the first thing while following Travis Boyd's trail, and it was a coincidence strange enough to make him stop, because among the list of people Travis had once owed money to was a name Frank had seen somewhere else recently. A shell company Vernon Stagg's organization used to launder money, and one link pulled another after it, until by the end of the week, Frank was sitting across from Roland in the office on the 40th floor, with a file he placed on the desk with the gesture of a man who didn't want to be the one bringing this news. "The night at the warehouse wasn't an accident," Frank said. Roland sat very still. For the 3 days after that night, he had treated it like an occupational hazard, an unexpected run-in with a crew of cargo thieves, exactly as it had been staged for him to believe. But now Frank was spreading something entirely different in front of him. Recorded calls, money transfers, a route changed at the last minute by the only person with the authority to change it. "They knew you'd be there," Frank said. "They knew exactly which gate your car would use, which route it would take, what time you'd arrive. Only a very small number of people knew those things." Roland looked down at the file, and the name appearing there, again and again in the records, was Otis Lund, the man who had stood beside him for years, the man he had trusted to arrange his movements, the man he had never once thought of when asking himself where that night had gone wrong. "Vernon paid Otis to betray you," Frank went on, his voice even but heavy. "The plan was to end you right there at the warehouse, clean and neat, make it look like a robbery. You were supposed to die that night." Then Frank stopped, because the next part was the hardest part, the part he had pieced together from the statement of a detained gunman and from what the scene had left behind. "The kid knew," Frank said quietly. "Caleb. Somehow he sniffed out that there was an inside man. Maybe he overheard something, or maybe he noticed Otis change the route for no reason. That night he tried to warn you, but he didn't make it in time. Everything happened too fast." Frank lifted his eyes and looked straight into Roland's. "He didn't take that bullet on reflex, boss. He knew who that bullet was meant for. He had 1 second to choose, and he chose to step in between." Roland said nothing for a very long time. For 3 days, he had carried the question of why a hired man would trade his life for someone like him, and he had answered himself by saying it was only reflex, only a moment when the body acted before the mind could interfere. Because that answer was easier, because it didn't require him to owe anyone anything conscious. But now that easy answer had collapsed. Caleb Whitlock, the man Roland had regarded only as a number in a ledger, had seen death coming and had enough time, even if only one brief second, to understand what was happening and to choose. He had chosen to stand in Roland's place, a man whose real name Roland had never bothered to ask, a man Roland had bought with the man's own desperation, had died a deliberate and conscious death so Roland could live, and Roland hadn't even understood that until now. He thought of Caleb's little sister, of the cold apartment and the clumsy waltz and the words about not letting anyone be sad alone, and he understood, with brutal clarity, that the kindness Caleb had given his sister and his final act at the warehouse were the same thing, the same person, the person Roland had been near for 2 whole years and had never truly seen. "Burn them all," Roland said at last, and his voice had returned to that familiar flatness. But Frank, who understood him better than anyone, heard beneath it something that had frozen into a resolve as cold as ice. "No," he corrected himself at once. "Don't burn them. Keep everything. Every recording, every number, every name. We're going to need them." And for the first time, Frank realized his boss was thinking of a weapon he had never seen Roland Maddox use before. It happened on an ordinary Thursday morning, when Hannah was walking to the bus stop for her new temporary shift at a laundromat, and a dark-colored car pulled to the curb beside her. 2 men stepped out with such quick, clean precision that anyone passing by would have seen only a young woman being picked up by friends, and before she could scream, the door had closed, and the city was sliding past beyond the dark, tinted glass. She didn't scream. She didn't thrash wildly, because in the very first instant of fear, something older than fear rose inside her, the old habit from childhood: count something, anything, until her mind became clear again. So she began to count. She counted the number of turns the car made, counted the seconds between every stop at a red light, listened to the sound of the elevated train echoing from the left before fading away, memorized the smell of engine oil and stale cigarette smoke inside the car, carved the faces of the 2 men into memory through the narrow space between the front seats. When the car stopped and they took her into a building, she counted the stairs, counted the number of doors they passed through, listened to the steady drip of water somewhere, and the low rumble of something that sounded like industrial machinery beneath the floor, and she remembered that the room they locked her in had a high window boarded over but still letting in one thin blade of light, that there was a water stain on the ceiling shaped like the state of Florida, that the door lock was new while the hinges were old. Vernon Stagg came to see her in the afternoon, and he wasn't rough at all, which was what made him more frightening. He pulled a chair over and sat down across from her with the polite manner of a man inviting her to tea, and he explained, almost kindly, that she had nothing to worry about, that she was only something to be exchanged, that as soon as Roland Maddox signed over control of the port, she would be sent home unharmed. "You're a very valuable card, young lady," Vernon said, smiling. "I waited for years for Maddox to have something to lose, and then you appeared." Hannah didn't beg. She looked at him and understood that fear wouldn't save her, but attention might. So instead of pleading, she began to talk, asking small questions in a trembling voice. She deliberately allowed to tremble, because people would say more in front of a frightened, harmless girl, and Vernon, arrogant and fond of hearing himself speak, took the bait. He talked about the port, about how long Maddox had blocked his path, and when he mentioned, almost smugly, that he had been waiting since the failed night at the warehouse, Hannah kept her face blank even though everything inside her had just turned to ice, because she had understood that the night at the warehouse was the night her brother died, and the man sitting in front of her was the man who had given the order. She kept counting, kept memorizing, every name he let slip, every location he mentioned, the way he called someone and spoke about a shipment arriving at the port on Saturday night, and she stored all of it in the place in her mind where she had always kept numbers, coldly and neatly, turning terror into data, because it was the only thing she could control. That night, alone in the locked room, she didn't cry and didn't pound on the door. She sat with her back against the wall and carefully rearranged everything she had gathered in her memory: the route of the car, the number of stairs, the Florida-shaped stain on the ceiling, the name of the shipment, the time, and she told herself that if she survived this, She wouldn't walk out as a victim someone else had saved. She would walk out carrying enough to bury the man who had killed her brother, in her own way, in a courtroom, under the light, with his real name written into the record. She looked at the dim slit of light on the boarded window and began counting as it shrank when night fell. And for the first time in her life, counting was no longer a way to survive fear. It had become a weapon. Roland knew Hannah was missing before Vernon even had time to call, because Dana had phoned him in a panic when Hannah didn't show up for work and didn't answer her phone, and by the time Roland's phone rang with an unknown number and Vernon's smooth voice came through proposing an exchange, he was already standing by the window on the 40th floor with a terrifying calm. Vernon set the terms, the port in exchange for the girl, the deadline at dawn, and Roland said he needed time to prepare the papers, his voice even, yielding, exactly the voice of a man who had been brought to his knees by his own weakness. And Vernon, certain he had read the board correctly, gave him that time. That was his mistake, because while Vernon thought Roland was kneeling, Roland and Frank were tracking Otis Lund. They didn't need to torture him. They only needed to show him the file, the call records, the money transfers, and Otis's empty face broke open with fear when he understood that he had been exposed. In exchange for a promise that he would be allowed to live, he gave them the location, an abandoned packing plant on the edge of the Southern Industrial District. Meanwhile, inside the locked room, Hannah wasn't sitting and waiting. She had spent the entire night and morning observing, and she knew the door hinges were old, knew the morning guard was careless and often left his post to smoke, knew he kept his gun on his left hip and carried the keys in his shirt pocket. When he brought her a bottle of water and a sandwich, she did what she had been calculating for hours. She pretended to faint, collapsing limply onto the floor, and when he cursed and stepped closer, bending down to check on her, she swung the heavy wooden slat she had pried loose from the window and struck him in the temple, not a wild blow but a precise one aimed exactly where she had planned, and he went down. Her hands shook violently as she searched his shirt pocket for the keys, and for 1 second she stood there, chilled by the irony, realizing that a blunt object had once been used to split her head open, and now a piece of her prison had just become the thing that gave her freedom back. But she didn't have time for that thought. She unlocked the door and stepped into the hallway, the very hallway where she had counted every door, moving in the direction she remembered as the one with the thin line of daylight. She was almost at the emergency exit when she heard a loud noise from the front of the building, a door being broken open, running footsteps, shouting, and she pressed herself into a dark corner, her heart pounding, not knowing whose men they were. Then she heard Roland call her name once, sharp and decisive amid the chaos, and she stepped out. They met in the corridor of that abandoned plant, he with blood that wasn't his on his sleeve, and eyes burning with violence held so tightly in check it had become almost still, and she with the guard's keys still clenched in her trembling hand. And in that moment, he looked at her and understood at once that she hadn't waited to be saved, that she had opened the door herself before he could reach her. "You got out on your own," he said, not as a question, and there was something in his voice almost like awe. "I was getting myself out," she answered, her breath broken. "You just arrived at the right time." Frank appeared behind Roland, nodding to signal that the area had been secured, that Vernon's men had been subdued without any major gunfight, because Roland had given a clear order from the start that this wasn't a massacre, this was a rescue, and everything had to be kept clean for reasons none of them except him fully understood yet. But Vernon Stagg wasn't there. He was too smart ever to be present in person at the place where someone was being held, and when Roland looked around the empty plant and understood that his enemy was still out there, he turned to Hannah, about to say he would handle the rest, about to return to the old instinct of placing himself between her and every danger. But she cut him off, still shaking, still pale, but her eyes blazing. "I know he has a shipment coming into the port Saturday night," she said. "I heard him on the phone. I remember everything, every name, every time. Don't kill him, Roland. I have enough to make sure he can never hurt anyone again, the right way." And Roland, who had come here with every intention of ending Vernon Stagg with his own hands, stood frozen for the second time before this woman. That night, after Hannah had been picked up by Dana and examined by a doctor, Roland sat alone in his office on the 40th floor, with Frank's file spread across the desk and the silence of the city stretched out beneath him, and he stood before the clearest choice of his life. He knew where Vernon Stagg was. He had the men, the weapons, the reason, and the version of himself he had been for 37 years wouldn't have hesitated. He would have ended this in the only way his world understood. A bullet in the dark, a body disappearing, a problem solved by making it stop existing. And no one would have blamed him, because Vernon had killed Caleb and kidnapped Hannah and deserved to die. The temptation was so strong he could almost taste it in his mouth. But he kept sitting there, and in his head was Hannah's voice at the kitchen table, asking him why a human being and a debt had become the same thing. It was the image of her standing in the factory hallway, with the key clenched in her hand, telling him not to kill him, that she had enough to do it the right way. And he understood that if he killed Vernon, Caleb's death would belong forever to the underworld, would be only one more body in a war between two monsters. But if he did it Hannah's way, then for the first time in his life, he would let real justice happen in the light, and that would be something worthy of the man who had died so he could live. He called Frank in. He didn't say much. He only pushed the file across the desk, combining the evidence of the warehouse ambush with everything Hannah had remembered about the Saturday night shipment, and he said all of it would be delivered to the right person, a federal prosecutor he knew couldn't be bought, through a channel that couldn't be traced back to him. Frank looked at him for a long while, because he understood exactly what this would cost, that bringing Vernon into the light meant opening a door that would let that same light fall on Roland's own organization, that using the port as evidence against Vernon meant Roland would have to let go of the very routes at the port he had bled to win, that this wasn't a victory but a calculated withdrawal from much of the power he had once held. "You understand what you're going to lose," Frank said quietly. "I understand," Roland replied. "That's why it has value." A few days later, when everything had been set in motion and the slow gears of the law had begun to turn, Roland came to Bridgeport for the last time as the man he used to be. He brought Caleb's phone with him, the cracked screen phone he had kept in his coat pocket for weeks, and he placed it in Hannah's hand. "I should have given you this a long time ago," he said. Hannah took it, her fingers lightly brushing over the cracked screen, and Roland, who had never told anyone this before, told her about Caleb's final seconds. He said Caleb hadn't panicked, that in the moment he lay on the warehouse floor, he had gripped Roland's sleeve and managed to say a few words, and Roland hadn't understood them until now. "He told me to tell Hannah that she could have done everything on her own," Roland said, his voice hoarse in a way Hannah had never heard before. "At the time, I thought he was delirious. I didn't understand, but I understand now. He wasn't worried that you wouldn't survive without him. He was worried you would never know you were strong enough not to need anyone at all." Tears ran down Hannah's face, but she didn't collapse the way she had that night at the hospital. She stood straight and let them fall, holding her brother's phone against her chest. And the circle that had begun with one desperate call to a dead man's number had finally closed. Not with revenge, but with truth and with a final message that had at last made its way back to the person it had always belonged to. 4 months passed, and justice came not with the speed of a bullet, but with the slow, weary, stubborn rhythm of the gears of the law, exactly as Roland had warned, and exactly as Hannah had chosen, even knowing it from the start. She went to the police station one morning and filed a complaint against Travis Boyd, telling the whole story under her real name, in a room with a recorder and a file that would exist forever, exactly as she had said she wanted that night in Dana's apartment. At first, it was only her word against his, exactly the bleak picture the young man at the diner had warned her would go nowhere. But Dana came and stood beside her, testifying that she had witnessed the way Travis treated the waitresses for years. And then something happened that Hannah hadn't expected. When word spread that someone had finally dared to stand up, 2 other women who had once worked at Halverson's contacted the prosecutor, then another woman after them, each carrying her own story, each one buried out of fear, just as Hannah had once been afraid. Suddenly, one woman's word became the word of 4 women, and the shadowy power Travis had always leaned on to threaten his employees turned out to be far thinner when it had to face a file thick with consistent statements. Travis Boyd was charged with assault and a series of other accusations, and though the process was long and exhausting, filled with interviews and delays, Hannah walked through every step of it with her head held high, because every step was hers, chosen by her, with no one doing it in her place. At the same time, on a much higher floor of the system, Vernon Stagg fell in the very way he had once despised, not in a bloody settling of scores, but beneath the weight of evidence. When a federal prosecutor received an anonymous file so complete it almost needed no further investigation. Call records, money trails, testimony about the warehouse ambush, and even details about a shipment coming into the port on a Saturday night that could only have come from someone who had heard Vernon say them himself. And those meticulous details, those numbers and names Hannah had carved into memory inside the locked room, became the thing tightening around his throat. Vernon's empire broke apart piece by piece as his associates turned one after another to cooperate with the authorities to save themselves. And the name Stagg, once something people lowered their voices to speak in dark clubs, now became a headline on the news with the word arrested standing right beside it. As for Otis Lund, the man who had sold out his loyalty for Vernon's gold, he vanished from the grid entirely, forced into state protective custody, as the primary witness whose testimony ensured the iron gates of the federal penitentiary would never open for Stagg again. One morning, standing before the small mirror in the bathroom of her new apartment, a modest place she had rented herself with money she had earned and not money someone had given her, Hannah swept the hair from her forehead and looked at the thin scar just beneath her hairline, much faded after 4 months, a pale white line no one would see if she wore her hair down. She had once thought she would want to hide it forever. But that morning, she left her hair swept back for a long while, looking at the scar in the mirror without turning away, because she understood that it wasn't the mark of something that had been done to her, but the mark of something she had passed through and come out of on the other side by standing on her own 2 feet. It wasn't a stain. It was proof that there had been a night when the ground had collapsed beneath her feet, and she had not only survived, she had stood back up, reclaimed her name, and turned the very thing that was supposed to destroy her into a foundation. She let her hair fall back down, not to hide it, but simply because she liked it that way, then went to make coffee, because that day was an important one, and she didn't want to be late. The important day Hannah didn't want to be late for was the first day she returned to the classroom, because she had enrolled again in the nursing program she had abandoned many years earlier, this time not to care for an ill family member, but because she had come to understand that choosing a profession built on looking directly at a human being in pain and treating them with dignity was the complete opposite of the world that had taken her brother from her, and she wanted the rest of her life to belong to the other side of that line. She still worked extra shifts to make ends meet, still counted every dollar, but for the first time, the numbers in her life had begun adding up in her favor. As for Roland, he did what no one in the underworld believed a man like him could ever do. He began to step back, quietly and methodically, turning what could be made legitimate into truly legitimate businesses, letting go of the port routes that had once been his crown, leaving behind a vacuum of power he no longer wished to fill. It wasn't quick, and it wasn't clean. The past didn't release people that easily, but he had begun, and more importantly, he had begun seeing a counselor, sitting in a quiet room every week to learn the hardest thing for a man like him, how to tell the difference between protecting someone and controlling them, between standing in front of someone and standing beside them. He and Hannah didn't rush anything. What grew between them wasn't the story of a wealthy boss rescuing a poor girl, because that was the very shape both of them had rejected from the beginning. It was something slower, more equal, built on evenings at the kitchen table and the times he learned to ask what she needed instead of deciding for her, the times she allowed him to come close without surrendering a single inch of the autonomy she had paid such a terrible price to reclaim. He no longer stood in front of her. He learned how to stand beside her. And on a late autumn afternoon, as they walked beside the river where he had once stood looking down at the black water on the night everything began, Hannah stopped, brushed the lock of hair away from her forehead so the wind could touch the thin scar that was now almost invisible, and she thought about the night a bottle had shattered against her head and the ground had seemed to collapse beneath her forever. Then she realized that the thing that was supposed to destroy her had turned out to be the beginning of the person she became. A woman who no longer waited for someone to come save her, a woman who knew she was strong enough to stand on her own, exactly as her brother had wanted her to know with his final words. And perhaps that is what this story wants to leave with each of us, that a person's worth does not lie in being sheltered by someone powerful, but in the right to be respected, to decide their own life, to rise on their own 2 feet, no matter how slow or painful the road may be, and that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone we love is not solving everything for them, but believing they are strong enough to do it themselves, and quietly standing beside them on that journey. If the story of Hannah and Roland has touched something in your heart, please press like, share this video with the people you think need to hear it, and subscribe to our channel so we can continue listening together to many more moving and meaningful stories every day. We would love to know how you feel about this story, whether it echoed anything in your own life, whether you have ever had to learn how to stand back up instead of waiting to be saved, or how to respect the right of someone you love to choose for themselves. Please leave a comment and share with us the feelings deep in your heart, because each of your stories is also part of what gives this channel its meaning. Thank you for listening all the way to the very last moment. We wish everyone watching this video abundant health, a joyful life, and peace and serenity every day. Goodbye for now, and we'll see you again in the next videos.